I am very excited and honored to introduce our first speaker this morning, who's Jonathan Blow. Jonathan is a friend of mine and someone whose work I really deeply respect. There are some game designers that I sort of have very elaborate models of in my head and kind of like refer to them and think, oh, what would that person do? What would that person do in this situation? What would that person think about this? And Jonathan is definitely one of those people for me. I really admire and respect his work, but also and especially his whole approach. Right? He has, I think, of all the game designers I know, I don't think anyone is quite as seriously committed to the idea of the importance of the work that we do as game designers and the kind of moral imperative that we have to think seriously about what we're making and the relationship that we have, the responsibility to the player to explore our ideas deeply and kind of like uncover the truth and uncover the beauty of the things that we're exploring. Obviously, Braid was a monumentally important game historically, a wonderful game, and something that kind of, in many ways, kind of ushered in an era of thoughtful, mindful, small-scale, personally driven work reaching a broad audience. And then for the past few years, he's been working on The Witness, which looks beautiful and mysterious and cool, and I can't wait for it to come out. And as that work is coming to a close, Jonathan's going to tell us a little bit about how he's thinking about his process and the ideas that he's developing, and maybe even a little peek into what's coming next. So please join me in welcoming Jonathan Blow.
How do I get my screen here?
Oh, this is the thing.
Oh, wait, I gotta just...
Yeah. It's just to the left. Is that?
Okay.
There we go.
All right. Well, thanks for that very nice introduction. It's a little bit redundant with my introduction, but that's how these things go. So yeah, this is the game of mine that most of you may have had an opportunity to play at least, and it's on display out there in the hall. This is a game I've been working on for quite a long time, The Witness. And unfortunately, it's not done yet. It's pretty close to done. I would be very happy if it were in your hands today, but it's going to be a little bit longer, not too much. Where this game is that, what you would consider as the game design is done. We're doing polishy things, both programmery polish and design polish. I might rebuild and redesign about 10 or 15 puzzles, which sounds like a lot until you realize there's 670 puzzles in the game, and then it doesn't seem like all so much. And it's been a very rewarding and gratifying project, even if at times it has been long and difficult to work on. But because the design's been basically done, even for the past year, we've been kind of 80-90% done, right? We've been on that last 80%. So I've had a lot of time to think about and prepare for what am I going to do next, right? And it's led to a lot of introspection. Like today, where do I see myself as a practitioner of game design really right now? Because when I go out in public and talk about The Witness at conferences, I'm sort of referring to ideas that I had at the start of The Witness that prompted the development of that game, right? And so for the past 4 or 5 years, I've been talking about 2008 or 2007 in my own personal timeline and where I am with ideas. And if you do that too long, it'll stunt your growth, right? So even though this game isn't completely done, it's time to do a new thing. But to tell you how I feel about all this, let's talk about something like space exploration, right? this is a little bit of a meme at this point, but for good reason. Like, we used to do cool stuff like sending people to the moon. Uh, we did, I think, 6 moon missions before we decided that there was no longer the sort of xenophobic imperative to keep doing moon missions, and they were really expensive. So then eventually we came up with this thing called the space shuttle that was kind of cool in its own way. I mean, it was pretty complicated and unwieldy, but result of bureaucratic processes. But it was a reusable space vehicle, and this was supposed to take us into the future, right? It was supposed to be the first of a line of reusable space vehicles, and once you can reuse your space vehicle, you can have all sorts of cool ships flying around like in Buck Rogers or something, right? There was some kind of linkage between then and now. But, as we all know, the space shuttle got kind of old and busted. A few of them exploded. The rest of them are now mothballed. And so now our space program is something like this, where we still have a international space station, sort of, and we send supplies up there to a small number of people. And then we do this kind of landing unmanned probes on places like Mars or comets now, which is pretty cool. And I don't want to go into this talk diminishing the size of these kind of accomplishments. These are amazing accomplishments that are the outcome of a large number of very smart people working for a very long time. It's kind of amazing that we can do this. However, if you rewind to the early 1970s and look at having done some moon landings and projected forward into the future, where would we be in 2014? You probably wouldn't have pictured this. You probably would have pictured something a lot cooler than this. So I'm not the only person who feels this way. There's a venture capital fund called Founders Fund whose tagline is, they promised us flying cars and all we got was 140 characters. And I'm very sympathetic. It makes me root for Founders Fund a lot more than most VCs I know of, which I don't have too high opinion of. Even if some of their portfolio companies make me a little bit nervous in terms of the vision of what they're trying to do. Well, I won't go into that. There's other people. So Elon Musk has a couple of companies that are really trying to shape the future. He's got SpaceX, which is looking at this problem of space exploration and attempting to be very ambitious about it, and so far making good strides. He tells this story where he one day went to NASA's website because he got excited about Mars, and he wanted to look on the roadmap for okay, when does humanity start a colony on Mars, right? How far in the future is that? Even if it's 50 years, 70 years, you'd figure there was a roadmap. And he says, well, no, they had nothing. There was no concept of going to Mars that NASA would speak publicly about. And he felt that this was a big problem, right? So this is his way of addressing that problem. It's kind of impressive so far. They now dock satellites with the International Space Station on occasion, and I don't think it'll be too long before they're doing bigger things than that. His other company, Tesla, down here, has been another example of making the future happen in direct counter to what everybody thinks is possible or likely. If you even go back 5 years ago, the public rhetoric about electric cars was that they were an idealist thing that was never going to work. I had lunch once with someone from California, some board in the state of California about sustainability and future transport, right? And she was like, "Oh, electric cars are dumb. They're never going to work." But they apparently do work. So there are now 50,000 Tesla Model S's out in the public and more every day. And there's this giant charging network. If you go back to 2008, 2007, which is not that long ago, that's when Braid came out. I hope that's not that long ago. The rhetoric behind electric cars was like, oh, well, they're little, they're tiny little golf carts that are kind of cheesy, right? They're not like real big gas cars. Well, Tesla just announced a car that goes 0 to 60 in 3.2 seconds, which is so fast. There's really just a tiny handful of cars in the world that are faster than that. So that's kind of amazing. And then the other argument that you would hear all the time was like, look, you just can't electric cars are never going to happen because there's no infrastructure. Like, oh my God, you would somehow have to make charging everywhere, and that's impossible, right? Now, never mind, for example, that we all have pressurized water into everybody's house. Do you think about like how much water moves and it's clean and it somehow crosses great distances and you just turn this tap? It's like way harder to move water than electricity, but we did that a long time ago, right? But then, clearly it's not that hard because Tesla just stood up and said, okay, we'll build an infrastructure, right? And so all these dots on this map are charging stations, and they're adding more dots. And you can charge your car pretty fast at any of these. And this is something that even I, as an electric car enthusiast, wouldn't have pictured possible in 2007 or 8, that they would make this much progress this fast. So this stands in stark contrast to like everything else that's happening, which is kind of very slow, lethargic, whatevering, right? Once in a while, people sort of stand up and say, screw it, we're going to do this, and they do it, and the results are really kind of impressive. So in general, out in the world, there's a relatively small number of people who I consider to be part of an ambitious project movement, right? I don't think this movement has a name. It's just people who care about the future and are not defeatist about it, right? Who believe that there are really good things to do yet. I see things in my daily life that frustrate me in this matter all the time. So this is the San Francisco Bay Bridge that goes from Oakland to San Francisco. And on the left is the old version of the bridge, which was built in 1930s. And you can also see a piece of it in the background on the left. And on the right is the new replacement span because, the bridge on the left was getting old and it was we were using it past its projected lifetime anyway, and there was earthquake damage, and it had to be replaced, right? The original bridge, the whole original bridge, was built in the 1930s in 3.5 years. It cost $77 million at the time, right? So this replacement of not even the whole bridge, just the eastern span, took 11 years, cost $6.4 billion, which if you adjust for inflation is 5 or 6 times as much as the old bridge. And with technology 70 years in the future from the old bridge. So what happened, right? Like somehow you would think that the technology would make us a lot more awesome at public works construction, or just the experience. Like we have 70 more years of experience at public works than we had back then, and yet this didn't seem to go very well, right? And again, we're not even talking about replacing the whole bridge. That's like still an old bridge back there that I drive on all the time. Now, it might look like the new bridge is a lot bigger or something, but it's not really, because the old bridge is like 2 layers on top of each other, with one direction going one way and the other direction going the other way. And the new bridge is just 2 layers side by side. So, it looks bigger, and maybe you don't have something on top of you, but it's essentially a project of the same size. So, like, what the hell happened there, right? Like, every day that I drive on that bridge, I'm like, what? Where is this promise of technology, right? Where did it bring us? And the worst thing about this, right, is when I say this, probably nobody in this room is shocked by a story of a construction project that took a long time and was expensive, right? This is like the new normal for construction. And why? Why is that? Let's think about that. Anyway, so another person who I sort of classify in this movement of people interested in the future is science fiction author Neal Stephenson. He started giving some talks a few years ago about the moon landing and other big projects, and was concerned that as a society, we may have lost our ability to do big things. And what happened, right? Why are we so bad at big, ambitious things? And he wondered, being a science fiction author, well, what role does science fiction play in this? And what can I do about it, right? So he started this initiative called Project Hieroglyph, which they actually just have a book of short stories that just came out. And the stories are about recapturing a little bit of that science fiction spirit, the optimism about the future, and the ability of people to be smart and do big things, which is what a lot of science fiction used to be like a while ago. And then sometime, maybe around the 80s, it all became dystopian, cyberpunk, post-apocalyptic future. The future sucks and is horrible and is corporate stuff. And he felt that science fiction writers have a role to play here, and that they had sort of been, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I won't. I'll just say that there's a bundle of issues there. Now, I'm very sensitive to the ability of fiction to inspire. This book here is Gravity's Rainbow, which is really, I think, a very interesting book. I've read it twice. Last time that I read it was in 2013, early to mid 2013, when I was still in development on The Witness, and it had been becoming a very long project. It was going on 4.5, 5 years, something like that at that time, which is longer than most people ever work on games to begin with. But because it was over a year and a half from now, we were not really anywhere near the end. I wanted very much to be near the end, but I was more like wandering through the desert, like, oh my God, I kind of maybe someday will know what the end looks like when I see it, but I look around and I don't see it. I just see dunes everywhere, right? So it's a very difficult time as a creative person. And I read this book again. I knew what I was in for because I'd read it before, but I read this book again. And when I started reading it, I just had this attitude like, oh my God, this is impossible. How am I ever going to finish this project? Right? This is terrible. And, here I held in my hands this work of great complexity and great ambition that was just beautiful, right? And the book was sort of saying to me, like, yes, this kind of thing that you're trying to do, it's possible, right? There are people who do this successfully. And it's interesting to me, and so that book kind of kept me going, right? It really, I almost can't verbalize, right? But I love this book is all I can really say. Like, I have feelings for this book that I don't have for most things, including most games, including almost any games. And so why, I'm a person who cares about games. I think about games all the time. I make games all the time. Why did I have to get inspiration from a book, right? Like, what's wrong with that picture? Okay. So, I'm getting toward the end of The Witness, and I'm wondering what's next. And if you look at this trend, it's maybe working, right? Braid took 3.5 years in development, which seemed like a really long time at the time. By the time The Witness is done, it'll be about 6.5 years, and I have a question mark there because who knows? It could take longer. But I'm hoping for 6.5 years. And so you kind of have to look at that trend line when you wonder what I'm going to do next. Like, if you extrapolate this geometric progression, you get 12.07 years, which seems like a long time. And I just described to you that I had some difficulty in the middle of a 6.5 year process, and I don't think I want to do that again. But, well, I don't think I want to do that again, right? So any hypothetical game 3, I feel like, hey, I would like to do it. I'd like to pop out a game in about 2 years, which is still, a lot of people feel like that's a really long time. But for me at this point, 2 years is like having lunch or something, right? Like you're done and like 2 years is over and you've hopefully got something. Now I'm saying game 3 here. That's a little bit of a facetious name because, first of all, because I've actually made way more than 3 games anyway, but since I sort of found myself as a designer, the number of major commercially released games is sort of 2 now. And so this would be the 3rd one. But the other reason it's facetious is this may not actually be the next game that ends up in people's hands. I may do like little palette cleanser things or something. But this is the next major thing, the next thing that I really care a lot about. So, I care a lot about it, but I would like to make games in 2 years. And actually that feels a little bit conceptually incompatible to me because, I really like the difference in depth and understanding that I've gained from going from a shorter project to a longer project. The Witness is just a much more thorough and mature and grounded game than Braid was. And part of that is probably just me being better as a designer because I've done more things. but part of it is really the calendar time that is available when designing the game, right? All the time during Braid and The Witness, I have some vision for what I'm trying to do, and I start nailing it like, oh, this is great, and that's great, and then I come to some situation, and it's like, well, I'm trying to make a puzzle or a moment in this game that fits what I need here, and everything I'm doing is terrible and like forced and ugly, and I just don't know what to do. But I've painted myself in a corner. I need something here because the rest of the game is built around this thing. That happens, not infrequently. And what I've learned when that happens is, if I just walk away and give it some calendar time, I can come back in 2 weeks or 2 months, sometimes in a year or 2 years. What I find is that I usually have a really good answer for that thing that I was stumped on. And who knows whether that's because my subconscious has been working on it, or because I allowed myself to go work on other parts of the game and then come back. Now I have more experience at this specific game and know what it needs, right? It's probably a collection of reasons that are causative of that situation, but I find it very beneficial. And so this game is tremendously better, I think, than it would be if we'd had to put it out in like 2 years. Like if I'd had a lot more money, right, and just had a giant team and was like, okay, let's go, let's start making this thing. I don't think it would be anywhere near as good as it is. And so this is the dilemma that I have, is that I want to make things on a much shorter time scale, but I don't want to sacrifice quality. So ideally, I would just jump on the other side of that geometric progression and do something for 20 years. Because, think about that. In 20 years, you could really understand a couple of things. Games are complicated, right? So here's what I've sort of concluded is that I'm going to do both in one project. So what I'm calling Game 3 is conceived as a 20-year-long project, but not as one continuous block of time. And I'm calling it Game 3 for the purposes of this talk, but in the way that it manifests in the world would be as a series of individual playable games, but not really episodic in the way that it's commonly thought of. Because, when you think about an episodic game, usually the episodes have to do with story, right? Or something like that. And this is more like games that relate to each other in terms of game design, right? There's some core principle that's the foundation of this 20-year project, and these games revisit that principle from different angles, right? Which will allow me as an author to keep looking into this same subject matter in different ways and deepen my investigation with each game, right? And yet, because they're individual pieces, I can do those pieces maybe, hopefully, on a 2 or let's be realistic and say if I aim for 2, it'll be 3 or something, but a shorter time scale, right? Now, if this doesn't make too much sense, like what even is that structure? An analogy that's not too far off might be like these book series that fantasy authors and sometimes sci-fi authors do, right? Where each individual book can actually be a very sophisticated and complex thing, right? In fact, that's why people love these kind of things, right? This isn't like the Hardy Boys or something where they knock out 100 books that somebody wrote in 2 days each, right? It's something that somebody really crafted, right? So something like that, where each piece stands on its own, but they add together to make something big, right? In one of these fantasy series, as the installments come out, you eventually get this really big tapestry of this really big world, right? So what would it be like if you did that not really for plot and setting and story? I mean, you could do plot and setting and story, but what if you did that about gameplay, right? How interesting would that be? So I've sort of covered part of this, right? Part of the motivation of doing a 20-year-long project is that calendar time, and it doesn't just help me solve problems like I mentioned, but solve problems in a quality way, right? Like in a way that really speaks to the subject of the game in a deep way, and in a way that helps create magic. Like you can't force magic, right? Those moments when somebody's playing a game and they were like, "Oh my God, what just happened?" Right? That was amazing. Like those you kind of can't crank those out on a schedule or out of a factory. I don't think. I haven't learned how to do that yet. Um, so so time will help with that. Uh, and then the other thing um, is my personal agenda or my personal interest in building this really vast and beautiful tapestry. And I don't think that every game should do that or have to do that, right? Small games are very beautiful as well, but um, there's something about my personal way that I'm using games to look at the world, right? Like there's sort of a way that I see game design. It fluctuates from day to day or year to year, but there's a general department of how I see game design. And I can use that as a lens to turn back and see the rest of the world. And it's very hard to describe what that is, but it's something about the world being comprised of, subjective moments that are unpredictable in advance, but that combine in a complex way to generate something even more unpredictable, like a bigger surprise at every moment, right? The world never stops with surprise. And when you really see that, when you really sit back and look at things that way, what you can see, or what I see, is it's so immense, right? It's so unfathomable that you almost basically can't do anything, right? It's just like paralysis of being faced by the universe. And so you can't, in building something measly like a game, you can't actually do justice to that grandness and that big thing. But from within my tiny human form, I want to try, right? I want to express something of this grandness and this vastness, and help people get a glimpse of the way that I see it, and something vast relative to my tiny self and my tiny brain and what it can hold is one way to do that. So, I've been talking in abstractions so far, but I want to say some things to clarify. I've actually already built a prototype of the first installment of this game. I started building it at GDC last year, 2013. I've since put in over a year of spare time and weekend work. While I was working on The Witness during the day, I'd go home or to a coffee shop and I'd work on this game at night. It's now got 40 to 60 hours of gameplay. And the reason I can stand up here and tell you that this is my next project is because those 40 to 60 hours of gameplay are really good. They're a worthy successor to anything in Braid or The Witness, right? It's not a puzzle game, though, which is cool, because I wanted to make something that's not a puzzle game. But even though it's not a puzzle game, I do get to effectively employ the sense of game design that I've developed over the last two games. And I've had a lot of fun doing that. So this is a talk that Mark Ten Bosch and I gave at IndieCade 2011, which is the closest that I've ever come to laying out how I design games. Like, what are the things that I think about? And we sort of presented it a little bit as a system, or sets of bullet points or sets of concerns, because that's how people want to hear things, and it makes it easier to digest. I don't really believe in a specific system of game design. I think it's way more of an art than that. But anyway, this is available on YouTube, and it's the closest that I've ever come to laying out exactly what I do from day to day. Now, one of the questions or concerns that I often get from this talk and one or two related things is people say, well, those ideas are all fine and grand, but they only apply to puzzle games. They don't apply to my game. And I didn't believe people who said that at the time. It felt to me like that was the response of someone who just didn't want to think about the ideas that hard, or didn't want to really look at them or apply them to their situation. And I can report that that is actually true, because I've used these ideas to build a non-puzzle game, and it came out great. So while I have the possibility of a tangent, let me talk about the GDC and the state of the game industry and link it to the moon landing and say all kinds of bad things. So, I started designing this game at GDC 2013. And I don't want to focus on GDC. I want to also talk about basically every other game conference in the world. This conference excluded, of course. So, I was making this game during the actual conference. At the start of the conference, I did my usual thing of the last several years at GDC, which is I start looking at the schedule. I'm like, no, I don't want to see any of this stuff, right? That year especially, I was dismayed by how much terrible social game stuff was going on, right? Monetize your whatever. I just didn't want to hear any of that. And, really something had been brewing for a long time. And I was like, this is stupid. There were a couple things that might have looked interesting, and I went to one and it was terrible, and I went to another and it was okay, But the okay ones, it's like, I can catch that on video after, right? So I felt like this was a giant locus of activity of a lot of people doing activities and saying things, and like I didn't care one iota about what anybody had to say. And that was, as soon as I made that clear to myself, it was a really strange realization. Like, it's not really GDC's problem. I mean, when people organize a conference, they obviously can shape that conference, and they've made some choices that I don't agree with, but really the problem is what most of the people in the game industry are interested in doing and talking about right now. It really has nothing to do with what I'm interested in doing and talking about. Now, I'm not a professional mathematician or a professional physicist, but I have a little bit of interaction with those circles. And my impression of a conference in math or physics is that when you go to it as a seasoned professional or academician, I don't know are you a professional? No. Whatever. As a seasoned person in the field, when you go to those, you actually are interested in the content of the talks and things. Even if you've read a preprint or whatever, like there's a lot of material being presented that's really difficult to absorb, and that's actually objectively about things that might be interesting in the world. And so, like people actually go to these conferences expecting to learn things and getting better at their field, right? At game conferences, it's not really true anymore. It used to be true a long time ago. But nowadays, like nobody who's really experienced at game development goes to a game conference expecting to really learn things. You might get lucky and learn a couple of small things over the course of your 3 or 4 days, right? For most of us who have been in the industry a while, usually what happens, there's a little bit of like fear of missing out. Like I want to go because maybe if I don't go, I'll miss something, right? There's a little bit of like, I get to see all my colleagues who I only get to see once a year, and maybe I'll have a conversation with one of them and learn something interesting, some insight about what they're developing, right? So it doesn't really come from the conference. It comes from like a small number of individuals that I might meet, right? Now, that's not true for beginners. Like these conferences are very valuable if you haven't been in the industry for a long time. Because there's just so much context that you haven't seen, right? And there's just so much that you can learn just by being exposed to it. But as you get more and more experienced, this like cone of what is relevant just keeps shrinking, right? And it eventually shrinks down to zero, disturbingly quickly, actually, after probably about 3 years, if you're really paying attention. But it's still really good for beginners, except there's a poison in these conferences and in this community. And I've been living in it for so long that it didn't become clear to me until I sat down to prepare this talk. And that is, there's this malaise of the experienced in the game industry, right? Everybody who's been in the industry for a long time has a certain, everyone is a blanket word, but basically everyone, has a certain cynicism or a certain, grizzled veteranality, right? For a variety of reasons, right? Because we've been through long projects, because we've been through projects that we had high hopes for and that came out badly, because we had projects canceled under us when the publisher didn't see the promise and pulled funding, because we had to do all the programming that some stupid designer thought was going to be a good idea that was obviously terrible. Like all these reasons contribute, right? And it's this weird thing where it's like that science fiction is all about dystopian, post-apocalyptic, cyberpunk futures. Like that's what everyone's vision of the game industry is like, and that gets communicated by osmosis onto the beginners, and that's really unhealthy. And I would say it's a reason for beginners maybe to stay away from these conferences. The other interesting aspect of this is that if you go to conferences, they're always sure to schedule inspirational speakers in 1 or 2 slots. And the thing about inspirational speaking, I don't know if all inspirational speaking is like this, but in the games industry, it's usually fake, right? It's usually like someone's got a really hard situation, and then they get up and they're like, yeah, inspiration, and then they go back and they're sad about their life, right? They're faking it till they make it, and then they probably don't make it, and you don't hear about them after a couple years. So why do we even go to that, right? So there's a whole situation here, is all I'm saying. But it's even worse for design than it is for some other departments, right? Because when I talk about this grizzled veteranness, right, usually my picture for that is tech people, simply because there are tech people that have been around a while, right? So if I think back 20 years ago to people who were doing the really big stuff that was very inspiring and ambitious and like, oh my God, I wish I could do that, right? It's people like, John Carmack, Tim Sweeney, Mike Abrash, those guys, right? Those guys are still around. They're still in games, and they're still doing stuff that's impressive and relevant. I don't think in any of those cases it's quite as amazing as what they did back in the day, right? But they're still working hard and being very productive and really contributing to what's going on in games. Think about game designers, right? How many game designers who were doing the things that were heralded 20 years ago are A, still in games, B, still actively designing things that are remotely on the same playing field of being as good or as relevant as the stuff that was heralded 20 years ago, and or C, the stuff that they actually made back then would sort of still be good by modern standards and wasn't just good because we hadn't seen much back then, right? And would be kind of trite today. I have a really hard time thinking of anyone who passes all those 3 tests. I can think of lots of tech people. I can't really think of any design people. So why is that, right? I don't actually know why that is. I could start rambling about it, but it probably would be a whole separate talk. But my facetious way of saying this is, we're here at this conference called Practice, right? This is for people who take seriously the art and the craft of game design. I presume, right? It's what it feels like to me. So who's the Bruce Lee of game design, right? Like if this is a practice, who's the total unbeatable badass who nobody else can touch, right? Who's the half a Bruce Lee of game design? I ask this question of myself, and I say, well, there just isn't one. There really legitimately isn't one. What does that say about this practice? And those of us responsible for the practice and developing it in its depth and its, leave it at depth. So let's get back to talking about ambition for a second. And I want to go back to John Carmack, John Romero type of thing. It may be hard for younger people to understand today, but this game in the early 90s was amazing, right? My response when I first saw this game, it looks like a pixelated mess to a modern viewer, but when I saw this running on my home PC back when it came out, my response was like, oh my God, I didn't know that this was even possible on a computer. It was so exciting, right? Kind of like sending guys to the moon was exciting, right? It heralds some kind of future where things are just going to get cooler and cooler. And part of what was impressive about this was tech. And if we're mostly focusing on design here, you might think, well, that's not too relevant. But it's relevant in a few different ways. First of all, I don't really think design and tech are all that separable, because any really interesting groundbreaking design is going to need some tech behind it, probably. Not always. But you need the tech to at least not conflict with what you do. In this case, this was a case of very strong technology, but the design was also pretty strong, especially for back in the day. I mean, we would look at it today and say, oh, it's pretty simplistic, but this was a really, really well-designed game. And you can tell, or it's just clear from how big this hit, that the design did not fail the technology, right? The technology was so amazing, and the design held its own. It didn't. You can look back at the history of games, and there's so many games that looked good but were horrible to play, or whatever. And this wasn't one of those. So there's that. But then also, again, I want to go back to that point about tech people staying in the industry for a long time and still doing relevant stuff, and come at that from a different direction. You might say this was really more of a tour de force of tech than it was of design. The design was good. Sorry to John Romero if he ever watches this. That's just how I personally feel about it. This is really a tour de force of technology and not of design. But I don't really have to be that sorry to John Romero, because if I look across the whole set of games, how many tour de forces of design actually are there? That really stand up today, that you don't just say, well, okay, in context, because we didn't know better, that seemed really good. How many can you really still look back at today and say, wow, that was impressive? If I time traveled back to, the early 90s, I could probably program Doom. I would have a hard time. It would be challenging to put it together in the way that they did at the time. I could design a better game than Doom now. That doesn't seem that hard, right? So, part of what that's saying is that design has advanced and we're better at what we do. But part of what that's saying is that we're just not hitting that many really strong points in design, right? We're not hitting it out of the park all that often. So maybe both in tech and in design, it's a lot harder now. Maybe we've picked all the low-hanging fruit. Certainly, technology-wise, it's hard to have the splash that Doom had now. You can't make a game with better graphics and have people really be impressed with that in the same way. But who even has the thought to try these days, right? Who sits down and designs a game where they're trying to make the audience say, oh my God, I had no idea you could do that on a computer? Nobody that I know is even trying. Well, a couple people are mildly trying. Right? There's this kind of fighting spirit that's not around anymore. We used to really have it. In the GDC, my first GDC was 1996, and everybody had some idea for some super ambitious game that was going to change the world. And we don't do that now because we're all grizzled and hardened and stuff. I've been in indie most of the time, but you can see this moon landing effect in AAA. So MMOs are kind of sort of the most, both technologically and design-wise, ambitious games that have been attempted by the industry. World of Warcraft is the last unambiguously successful MMO, right? A lot of games have come after it that have basically tried to clone it. As of this month, World of Warcraft is 10 years old, right? We kind of haven't done another moon landing after this. We've done copycats that sort of crashed or whatever. And really, you might think of some other ambitious games like, oh, EVE Online. Well, EVE Online's actually a year older than this. That's from 2003, right? So we have these games that are still somehow running, which is cool, but we're not being successful at replicating them even, much less surpassing them, right? And to be fair, when World of Warcraft came out, it was really kind of a lot like EverQuest. So it's not like, I can't pin exactly. I'm not trying to place World of Warcraft at some kind of high point in game design, but I'm just saying there was generally some stuff that happened, and generally that's in the past now. And why is that, right? once in a while, a game with a spirit of ambition happens. So at E3 this year, this game No Man's Sky was shown, and it got a really strong response. People were like, "Oh wow, that's amazing." This is actually the same kind of thing that people were talking about all the time in 1996 to 8. Hey, we're going to procedurally generate lots of crazy stuff, and you're going to be able to go visit. It's just closer to being able to be reality now, and somebody hasn't given up on that kind of vision, and people are really excited for that. The fact that they're so excited for that is a signal that we're not really doing this that much anymore, because if there were a lot of games like this wouldn't get that much attention, right? It's good that it's getting attention, but I also wish we had more of this, right? Anyway, so I was vaguely aware of this kind of situation when I started this Game 3 in 1990 or in 2013. So I had a couple of goals. I was like, look, I don't feel like design is as hardcore as programming in terms of technology or seriousness of the practitioners. Design is very unconstrained. Your ideas in design are not so often tested clearly by reality. So it's just very easy to have random opinions and go for years believing that your random opinion is right. Whereas in programming, you kind of fail pretty fast if your opinions are too far wrong, right? So I was aware of that, and I said, well, you have to make up for it. Like, if you're training in Kung Fu or something, you do exercises. You don't just look at your muscles and wish that they would get big and strong, right? You do things to make your muscles strong. So part of what this was an exercise. Like, I want to expand my abilities as a designer. I want to design something that's out of my comfort zone that'll make me better. And that was really fun. It was, again, it was a conscious effort to build toward my own personal future, which was a little bit foreign to me because I was so used to like just toiling on these projects. Yeah. So, and design goals that I would have expressed, without being too specific is, I want this game to be like Gravity's Rainbow in certain sense. Not in any really tangible sense. Like, I don't think you'll be able to take this game when it's out and hold it next to Gravity's Rainbow and draw correspondences. But there are aspects of the book that I really, really love. Like, it's a very high dynamic range book. You have big things happening and small things happening, and you have massively important things happen, and you have like stupid trivialities where you're like, did you really want to include that in the book, dude? And you have things that are very tender, and you have things that are highly offensive. And really, this book it's not afraid to fly. Like, it's not, and it's not afraid to leave you behind when it flies, right? It expects you to do some work and flap your wings and come with it, which is really something that we don't do very much in games anymore. We learn not to do that because early games were so hard to learn. But I think we could go back and unlearn that a little bit, while being keenly aware of the difference between flying and maybe leaving someone behind, or just being arbitrarily hostile to that audience, right? So what does a 20-year project look like in concrete terms? Like some other ambitious thing, like sending a rover to Mars, you have to design for the elements, right? I have to, whatever this project is, has to survive the weather and other environmental conditions between now and 20 years from now. Means it probably has to be self-funded, or if it's not, then I somehow have to have some reliable way of convincing people to give me money 18 years in the future. I don't know how you do that. I probably have to keep ownership of the project, which is related to self-funding, right? Like, it's not like I can get funding from Electronic Arts and then they expect to own part of it, and that somehow doesn't bite me for 20 years and lets me do what I want to do. That's not going to happen, right? You need to control the technical foundations of the project, because 20 years is a really long time. Platforms come and go. If you build on your favorite game engine that you don't own and that you don't have the license to, 10 years from now or 5 years from now, you're going to need to switch platforms. And it may be very difficult to switch platforms. They may be late doing it. Their support for that platform may be bad. They may decide not to support it. They may sell their company to Microsoft, and then no more development happens. Or they may choose to support that platform but charge extortionate fees for that support, right? So you don't want to tie yourself to technical underpinnings. specific technical underpinnings that way. You can't really assume any particular life situation. So right now I'm fortunate in the sense that I've had a relatively successful game, gave me a lot of funding that I've now mostly spent to build the next game. But I've got a team working on this thing, and you can build bigger, more ambitious things when you have a team. I don't know if that's the case 20 years from now, right? So what happens if I start to build this ambitious game structure with high production values and like really cool guys running around with like the most impressive shaders you've ever seen, but you look at the code and it's just really hard to all hold in my head. If I end up in a life situation where I no longer am working with a development team like that, I may not be capable of continuing and completing this series. So that lends considerable situation to what this series looks like at the beginning, right? Most people, like if I'm lucky and the witness breaks even, I'll have at least enough money left to do a similarly sized project, but I don't think it's necessarily wise to do a high production value project like that. And then again, in terms of design constraint, like that series of fantasy novels, the design needs to feel complete but reopenable. You don't end one of those in the middle of a sentence or in the middle of a scene. I mean, you could. You'd be very intentional if you did that, right? In general, you want people to feel satisfied with what they've got and have space for more, to add more. And what does that mean in terms of game design? Well, I don't know, but it's not that much like a lot of game designs that already exist. So I want to visit this level of production value. I've already implied that for life circumstance reasons, it may be a good idea to do a lower production value game. But also for practice reasons, right? There's this idea of compound interest that I'm very concerned with these days. And I became aware of it in programming, right? When people ask for advice in programming, I always say, well, you've got to do it, and you've got to make sure your tools are good, and just you don't put yourself in a life or work situation that prevents you from working effectively, because the more programming you do, the better you get at programming, right? Which means you learn more faster, which means you get better at programming faster, and your rate of accomplishing new things increases, which then allows you to learn more faster, et cetera, right? It's a feedback loop, like we should be familiar with in game design, right? And it's a lot like compound interest, right? So the same thing is true in design. I don't think it's as tangible or as strong of an effect, but it's still true in design. So if I look at a 20-year project and I say one of my design goals is to achieve deep understanding, well, now suddenly, rather than being 20 years of me doing some vague things in life and how did that come out at the end, there's like a score at the end, right? It's like at the end of this project, how deep did the understanding go? And if I spend a lot of my design time dealing with production value kinds of issues, which inevitably happen, like, oh, when this guy's animation does this, we have to figure out what is most intact for the rest of the work to like do there, right? That takes time, and it may take time away from depth of exploration of the subject. On the other hand, right, I know lots of designers who do very low production value games explicitly for the reason they say, oh, I just want to iterate and become a better designer. I think that's a good idea, but if you go too far that way, you miss part of game design, because part of game design is about nuance and subtlety, and you kind of can't explore certain dimensions of nuance and subtlety unless you have them in your game to begin with, right? So production values help you that way, but they can really slow you down, right? And so in the past game or two, I may have erred a little too much in the other direction if my concern is deepest understanding. Or maybe I just needed to do that level of production value to build up skill to a certain level about nuance, and then now maybe I can just go straight there. Like, you can make a very beautiful game. Like, low production value doesn't necessarily mean ugly, right? You can make a beautiful game without so much infrastructure. But well, I don't know. There's a lot of concerns. One other concern is just objectively, not even just financially, but in terms of the enjoyment of your player, it's probably going to be decreased. Um, you uh, people your game design gets better when it has nicer animations, right? Your game design gets better when the bitmaps look better. And a lot of people don't want to believe that, but I've found it to be true. All right, so if you're doing a 20-year project, a few other things click in your head, like investments suddenly make sense. Like the idea, oh, hey, I'll spend 2 years just making a programming language so that I can use it and be happier and more productive for these other 18 years. Suddenly, that's a sensible idea, whereas it may not have made sense before. Although weirdly, that's, again, another purely cognitive effect. Like I had been hoping to build games and get better at making games for 20 years at least anyway, right? But suddenly when there's a scorecard, it makes things very, very visible, very concrete. It makes you really consider those decisions carefully. So then the last thing I want to say about all this is, I've decided to do a couple of ambitious things like this 20-year project and design a programming language and all that stuff. And I feel a really heavy weight has been lifted, and it's that kind of weight of the grizzled veteran that I discussed that happens at conferences. When I started out in games professionally in the mid 1990s, I was trying to do things that were ambitious and that nobody else had done. And they were tilted toward technical things at that time, but there was also a good element of design ambition. And so I have, this model in my head of what was happening, that there's some big space of unknown things and some space of known things. And we try to explore into the unknown territory and mark out areas with each new project. So, I might go over in this corner and then try to shoot out to where that black dot is, or go over there and try to shoot out to where that black dot is. And I haven't actually drawn new explored territory in this diagram, because actually what would happen for me early on is I was always way too ambitious and these projects would not succeed in a meaningful way. Most of the learning that I got from them was, well, I won't do that again. Not totally true. Like my skills developed, but I had a lot of negative experiences. And so here's the thing about negative experiences and what happens a lot in the game industry. And so I want to explain this operant conditioning experiment, and it involves a slight amount of animal cruelty, which is actually sad, but we might as well understand what we came to understand through doing this, right? There's a psychological phenomenon called learned helplessness, which is understood to be very active in humans, right? You have a dog, and you put him in a little place where he can sort of hang out in both sides, but it's hard to get from one side to the other. You've got to jump this hurdle, right? And the floor produces electric shocks, one half at a time. And anytime you're going to instill a shock, right, you warn the dog by playing a sound on the speaker, like a little bell or something. And as we know from Pavlov's experiment, dogs are really good at associating these two events. So the dog hears the noise. He's like, oh, crap, I got to get out of here because I've been shocked the last couple of times. So he jumps to the other side, and then he's safe, right? Happy dog, unless you decide to be extra cruel to the dog and you tie him down to one side so he can't move. He can't jump. And you do this before you've ever done the experiment. So he hasn't learned that he can jump yet, right? And so now he has no choice but to get shocked every time. He hears the noise, he gets shocked. He tries to escape, maybe, he can't do it. He hears the noise, he gets shocked. After enough time of this, you can remove the harness. He's no longer tied. Next time he hears the bell, he cowers and whimpers and gets shocked. He doesn't jump to the other side because what he's learned from all these experiences is that life sucks and he can't do anything, right? And that he's helpless. Whereas if you put a new dog in the experiment, he'll just jump away, right? After he's been shocked a couple times. This dog may be a lost cause. So, and this isn't limited to dogs, right? There's examples, elephant trainers start out by tying elephants to a giant massive stake that really holds them in place. Elephants are huge beasts, but eventually you can use a much lighter stake because they're used to being tied to the stake and know they can't get away from it. So let me relate that to this process. Early in my career and early in many people's careers, I think we tried to do a lot of ambitious things and failed a lot. And we learned that we failed and we said, well, we'll never do that again. But times are different now for a lot of reasons. Um, computers are faster. It's easier to do a lot of things on computers. We can be better at what we do. So this is a mathematician named Paul Erdős who died a little while back. He was very, very prolific. He wrote over 1,500 mathematical papers, all presenting new results in mathematics. He's renowned for many things, kind of an eccentric guy. But one of the talents that he had was the ability to gauge a problem and know exactly what is the right thing to attack right now, what's too hard, I'll just get frustrated, and what's easy enough that maybe it's not worth bothering with, we'll let someone else do that, right? And that's a skill that you can build that I think I was not very good at 20 years ago, and I think most people in the games industry were not so good at 20 years ago, right? So this territory that I was envisioning as well, there's sort of a line here, right? It might be more fractal, right? It probably has areas of higher difficulty and lower difficulty, and the ability to discern those shades is a skill that you can have and that I believe I've built at least a little bit. So instead of trying to plow through from this obvious point up front to get there, right? Maybe you can sort of come through this lighter path on the side and cut over from the right and only have to plow through dense jungle for about a third of the distance as you could have, or as you would have had to, right? Or maybe you just say, well, that black point there that I was trying to get to is a little bit arbitrary. Why don't I just place it even deeper into this territory at the tip of this easy to reach place, right? That's a skill that I think I'm starting to observe among game designers, but only just starting, right? But once we're armed with it, I think we can do a lot better than we ever did. Also, a lot of us have a lot more experience at the brawn of making games. We've just made some projects, right? Back 20 years ago, there were some people who had made some projects, but they were dinkier, like computers were getting bigger, games were getting a lot more ambitious. Like these days, if you're experienced, the experience is yours, right? And if you're new, there are a lot of people with a lot of experience that's relative to or relevant to what you're trying to do that you can learn from very quickly, right? We never had that. And the last reason why we can be more ambitious now is just that we've got maps of this territory of all this failures, right? And we can use those maps. And we haven't been using them lately. And it's a little bit of a shame. So let me go back to Bruce Lee for the conclusion here. There's an inspirational quote, right? And I've expressed my cynicism for inspirational quotes. But Bruce Lee says, if you always put limits on everything you do, physical or anything else, it will spread into your work and into your life. There are no limits. There are only plateaus, and you must not stay there. You must go beyond them. And there was a time in the past when, I would have looked at something like this and said, yeah, okay, words of wisdom, that's great. But the more that I have experience in these kind of areas, the more that I understand that this statement is literally true. He meant it, and it's true. And if we choose to ignore this sentiment, we're doing it for reasons of, ego protection, for reasons of wanting to feel good about where we are now compared to the immense potential of where we could be, right? And the reason I'm talking all about, learned helplessness and plateaus and all this stuff is that this is exactly what I observed, not just in the games industry, but in myself. I still manage to do some pretty ambitious things. When The Witness comes out, I think people will agree it's pretty ambitious. But I also think I can do more now, and it's time to do more. So not all games have to be big and ambitious. Small games are beautiful, and like I said, we've staked out some territory of game design, and lately we have a lot of games that are being very creative in terms of sort of finding little crevices inside the existing territory and filling them out. Like a game like Gone Home or Papers, Please or something like that are very, very nice uses of the existing territory. And there's totally nothing wrong with that. I'm very glad that we have those games, and it's been a wonderful addition to get them because we sort of didn't have them for a while. So I'm not knocking that stuff at all. I think we need more of that. But I also think there's this very crucial element of explorative ambition that we're missing, right? We're missing people who want to go to the moon and want to go to Mars. And we've been missing that for a while. And the fact that we've been missing it is subtle. so subtle that I didn't even clearly realize it until I sat down to prepare this talk. So that's it. Some of us know that this kind of ambitious moonshot thing is our department. I've always felt that that was my department. Like, I got into games wanting to do super ambitious things, and I want to do them now. And I feel that it's time to do them. I feel that we as an industry are once again ready, and that I'm ready. So thanks for listening to me ramble, and that's all I've got to say.
So we're a little bit over time, but maybe is there a time for one question, just for formalists? No, that's good. It was a beautiful talk, but I feel uncomfortable if we don't have at least one question. So one quick question, then we'll give everybody a nice coffee break, and then we'll come back. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm familiar with that. I can't answer that question. Should I repeat it a little bit?
Yeah, mathematicians and scientists doing their important work.
When you're 25 is sort of the figure. So I can't answer this competently because I'm not really a mathematician or a physicist, but I know of this idea the same as you do. On the one hand, I guess maybe that's true, but on the other hand, Leonard Susskind is kind of a badass. He's more of a badass than Batman, and he ain't young. There's a lot of people like that. And I feel like, my personal impression is that as math and physics have become, there's some wavefront of what you know and how much you need to know to get to that wavefront of new understanding. And that keeps getting pushed back as understanding becomes deeper, right? And so I think that, and really this is not a competent answer, but I think that may be changing over time, simply because there's more to know before you get to the real stuff. But I don't know. I'm sorry, Leonard. Why did I say that about Leonard Susskind? I mean, there's a number of physicists who are like serious dudes who are not 25, for example.
I have one last question. Will Game 3 be written in Highlight?
Game 3 is currently in C++, but I may rewrite it in another programming language. I probably will, because it'll be a good test of whether that language is practical.
Nice.
Yeah.
Awesome. That's exciting.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Why don't we take...